To start our day today, I'd like to firstly welcome you here, but acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we all meet. Here today, we are on the lands of the Gadigal and Wongal people of the mighty Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge all Aboriginal people who are joining us here today. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal lands, the many diverse Aboriginal lands from which you all are joining us from today. And I'd like to acknowledge the unbroken links between country, culture, land and seas that Aboriginal people have maintained since time immemorial. I'd like to acknowledge the incredible resistance and resilience of Aboriginal women, particularly in the face of sexual violence, and pay my respects to all of those women who have stood before us. I note that it was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. We are so delighted that you have joined us for our webinar today. Our key question is, what will it take to end the epidemic of sexual violence in Australia? We'll briefly cover today our 50-year history. This year, Full Stop Australia celebrates or commemorates really our 50 years of service to communities in New South Wales, firstly, and across the nation. Then we'll have a look at the key question of what will it take to end sexual violence? And today we'll be focusing on two particular elements of that question: how it is that our response to people who've been subjected to and impacted by sexual violence can help end and support those who've been affected by this scourge across our society. And we'll be looking at our law and policy systems and how we can focus on law reform to end sexual violence and indeed mitigate, mediate and eliminate the way that those systems impact negatively on victim survivors. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Tara Hunter, who is the Director of Clinical and Client Services at Full Stop Australia, and Tara will be joining me in discussion in a moment in relation to our response and how response is a critical part of ending sexual violence. I'm also joined today by Emily Dale, who's the Head of Advocacy at Full Stop Australia, and Emily will join me in a conversation about policy and law reform and what are our priorities and what do we need to address urgently to end sexual violence. I note that today we will be talking about rape and sexual assault. We'll be talking about violence and its impact on people who are subjected to it and those who are otherwise impacted. We'll look at communities and the way violence drives us. So please be aware and take care of yourselves in this conversation. Please note that on Monday morning, you'll receive a recording of the presentation and an evaluation survey. Along the way, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, which we will be happy to follow up on our social media accounts. Today, we won't have time to take questions during the webinar, but we look forward to responding to your questions and commentary over the coming weeks. So today, we're really going to start by having a little look at our history. So Full Stop Australia started in 1974 officially as the Sydney Rape Crisis Collective. This followed the period where the women's liberation movement in Australia took hold in the early 70s, with hundreds of women meeting to have important conversations about women's safety. Women marched on various institutions in Sydney to demand a response. And in 1974, a forum in Sydney on International Women's Day formed the idea of the Rape Crisis Collective. And we'll hear a little more about that in a moment. But we commenced in the 29th of October 1974 is when we opened. And we did receive a response to this very polite letter requesting funding for the Rape Crisis Centre in mid-1975. Funding has been such a critical part of what we do. We can't do our work without the support and work of our specialist trauma counsellors, our team that keeps the organisation running. And as we head into 2024, 50 years after we commenced, we know that we still need to talk about funding. We still are not fully funded, and much of our work requires and relies on philanthropy and corporate support. Our 1-800 full stop number, which is a national support service for anyone impacted by sexual, domestic and family violence, continues to be funded only by the generosity of our donors, and we always need more support. We're built on strong foundations, and let's see a little of the beginning of our organisations and our roots.
It's a different situation in Australia, where rape crisis centres are only just starting to make an impact. There's one in Melbourne and this one in Sydney. They're regarded cynically by some police. They think the women who run them are hysterical. But the women, many themselves rape victims, say the centres fill a desperate need.
In 1974, we filled a desperate need. I'm not sure that the women who commenced our work in 1974 knew that we would still be fighting the same battles in 2024, but they set us up for a future that we've been able to continue to focus on. In 1974, we were set up with 3 objectives: to provide support, to change the law and advocate, and to educate and make sure that the community understood the issues so that we could end sexual violence. Those 3 pillars are still the heart and soul of our organisation, and we continue to focus on them. So, what will it take to end sexual violence? Let's have a little look first at where we are in Australia in relation to sexual violence. We call it an epidemic, and some people might say, oh, is that an overstatement? Look at these figures and and you can decide. An estimated 2.8 million of aged 18 years and over have been subject to sexual violence since the age of 15. 2.2 million of those are women. More than 1 in 3 girls and almost 1 in 5 boys experience child sexual abuse, according to the Australian Child Maltreatment Survey, a shocking figure by anyone's estimation. We've seen a real increase in sexual assault in New South Wales between 2018 and 2023. And we know, as many of you will know, that the impact and the burden of violence, sexual violence, sits particularly heavily on some communities, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and women with a disability, but LGBTQ plus communities of all kinds. And we know that in regional and remote Australia that there are significant challenges in relation to rates of sexual violence and the capacity for response. So for us, we see this as a significant social problem that requires a significant social response. I want to turn first to Tara Hunter, our Director of Clinical and Client Services. Tara, tell me, when it comes to responding and supporting victim survivors, what does it look like and what will it take for us to do that in a way that helps end the violence against women?
So I think, Karen, as you say, and we still hold many of those really strong foundations that started off in 1974. So we provide a really safe space for anyone that's impacted by sexual, domestic and family violence. But in the context of our New South Wales Sexual Violence Helpline, which is where we started, we see people across the lifespan. We see, you know, if you look at our data around age groups, we do see more people from the under 25 age group. From my perspective, I would hope that we would see more children and young people. I think one of the really important things is that we create accessible and responsive service systems for people that have just been recently assaulted, and we'll talk a bit more about when people present at our service, But what we want to see is people being safe to come forward at the time of an event. We also provide services to all genders, all communities, and as Karen has talked about, we see barriers for people, and even with our service, I know some of the work that we're doing this year is really trying to make more focus on actually looking at the barriers experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, women with disabilities, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, so migrants and refugees, and also from people from LGBTQ plus communities as well. We know that they experience increased risk, but also increased barriers. So a service like ours, at the front door, we try and meet you where you're at. So it doesn't matter whether you have experienced an assault in the last couple of days, or whether it was 6 months ago or 6 years ago. We know that when you're calling a service like ours, you're in crisis, or you might be a family member or a friend, or you might be a service provider that's ringing on behalf of someone that's been impacted. So what we see is that the majority of our callers call 6 months after they've actually experienced an assault. And we know that that sits really is very much aligned with how long it takes people to come forward. And we know that a big part of the population never even come forward to services like ours. Most people will reach out to family members and friends. But sadly, and when we talk about what it takes to end sexual violence is, removing that cloak of silence. So we know that there are also many people out in our community that never come forward and talk about what's happened to them. The essential part of our service is it's based on safety. So we want to be a safe place for people to talk about what's happened for them, but also in our first instance, we also need to assess people's safety in terms of their physical safety, their psychological safety, their immediate needs. So if we've got people coming to us in crisis, what service systems we can refer them to. People might be seeking medical or forensic care. They may want further information around going to police and what that might look like. And then further down the track, people might want support around talking to family members and friends. We ourselves might provide that support for family members and friends. And then there's an essential role in supporting people through a legal process if that's what they choose. What we see in service systems these days, they're very oriented towards crisis. And one of the unique parts of our service delivery is that we'll work with people throughout that journey. We know that healing and recovery is not a linear process, and that people might access our service within the first week of their assault, and then they might represent a year later or 3 years later, and that we're able to meet people with, at that point and look at what their support needs are at that time, with a real view around providing information and support so that people have choice and agency around what happens next, that we really focus on people's well-being and their capacity to keep themselves well and safe, and give them the skills and the tools to, function in, in their world and their lives. And this is a human right. When people have had the right to be safe violated, then we have an obligation to give people access to services to heal and recover. So that's one of the really essential parts in creating some change. And it forms a part of prevention when people have effective service delivery. It means that people can hopefully be, not continue to be assaulted, not to be re-victimised in the future. And so to provide some safety and support.
So response really is prevention, because not only does it help us open the vault on sexual violence in our community and make sure that rape and sexual assault is seen, but it also means that people can get the support they need that might help them navigate their own experience and their future more safely.
That's exactly right. And part of opening up to family members and friends, we work with frontline professionals, we work with a whole range of organisations. It's also about lifting that cloak of silence across the community. So a big part of, while we work with, confidentiality and privacy is one of the key things to us as working individually with people. But as an organisation, we have really strong commitment to supporting people to be safe, to actually talk about their experiences if they choose as well. And we really need to, as a community, the more services we have available, then the more awareness is generally across the community.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that we've really noticed in this, there's a national conversation very much on the front foot right now around domestic and family violence, Tara. And one of the things we see is that increased risk and the link between sexual violence and domestic violence, and how critical it is that we make sure that specialist response happens around sexual violence so that that gets addressed to reduce trauma, but also enable people to move to recovery and healing.
Absolutely. And so if we're not on the front foot around having this conversation, asking people routinely about sexual violence and sexual coercion in the context of domestic and family violence, then we're missing a key risk factor. But we're also sending a message that it's not safe to talk about this.
Yeah.
So we really need to be committed as a community to start having those conversations and acknowledging that sexual violence and sexual coercion is a very common part of domestic and family violence.
Absolutely. Which kind of takes us to our next focus, which is really around the kind of legal and policy context. I showed you a clip earlier from Four Corners, which told you a little bit about the start of the Sydney Rape Crisis Centre. That Four Corners program also dealt with the broader legal context, which made sure that sexual violence was not being dealt with. Let's have a little look at what Four Corners heard back in those 1970s conversations.
The fact that I was in a court situation, I suppose I was very naive, that I expected that in a court one would get some sort of justice and that things wouldn't be stacked so heavily in the rapist's favour.
In 1975, when Four Corner made that program, they were really highlighting some of the challenges of the legal system. I want to bring in Emily Dale, Head of Advocacy at Full Stop Australia. Thanks for joining us, Emily. Have things changed? What do we need to do to start really addressing, as Tara said, we've got to respond and we've got to have these broader conversations in our community, and then we need our systems to be equally responsive. Tell me, Emily, what sort of challenges remain in the broader legal system for victim survivors and their families and communities?
Thanks so much, Karen. And to answer your question, things haven't changed nearly enough, as is clear from the statistics on the screen. So when we ask what justice is, we need to recognise that the justice system has a big role to play in responding to and aiming to prevent sexual violence. As you can see from these figures on the screen, we still have a long way to go. We at Full Stop believe that the justice system should be a place where anyone who's experienced sexual violence can go to receive justice. It should be safe and fair for everyone. It should treat all victims of crime with respect, and it should hold people who use violence to account. But currently, justice systems across Australia aren't working as they should. We know that sexual violence is prevalent in the community. As you've already outlined, Karen, 1 in 5 women has experienced sexual violence in her lifetime, and 1 in 5 boys and 1 in 3 girls has experienced child sexual abuse. We also know that sexual violence remains vastly underreported. As you can see from the figures on the screen, the latest ABS data shows that reporting rates by women who've experienced sexual violence are below 8%, and that there's been just a 2.7% increase in reporting of sexual violence over the last 50 years. Partly as a result of these low reporting rates, convictions for sexual violence are extremely rare, and that means that the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of these very serious crimes are never held to account. And finally, we know that victim survivors of sexual violence often feel disempowered and re-traumatized by the justice system. And that's more often than they feel seen, heard, and believed. The survivor advocates who Full Stop Australia works with and supports, and who've chosen to report sexual violence to police and perhaps go on to court, have consistently reported feeling like they lacked agency, choice, and support through that process, and that they were made to feel like they were the ones on trial. Clearly, not enough has been done, and the justice system needs to catch up and properly support people impacted by the very serious crime of sexual violence.
So what do we need, Emily? How can we start to make that transformation that we need to see in the legal system response?
What we need is to reimagine the justice system. If we hope to create a system that delivers true justice and holds all people who use sexual violence to account, we need to do 3 key things. Firstly, we need to take the burden of engaging with the justice system away from victim survivors. This means addressing aspects of that system that continue to cause pain and trauma to people who have experienced sexual violence. Things like cross-examination in court, which continues even today to be invasive and re-traumatizing, and inadequate support engaging with police and prosecutors so that victim survivors don't feel like they have real agency in the justice system. We need to ensure that everyone who's experienced sexual violence feels safe, supported, and empowered to seek justice. Secondly, we need to build a culturally safe and trauma-informed justice system. This means recognizing the impacts of trauma and embedding that knowledge throughout the justice system. It means comprehensive training for police, prosecutors, defense counsel, and judges on the impacts of trauma and how best to work with victim survivors of sexual violence. And it means embedding support in the justice system to help victim survivors engage with the process and access the services that they need. Simply seeking justice shouldn't be a painful and traumatic process. Thirdly, we need to remove unjust barriers that continue to impact victim survivors of sexual violence. The justice system should be accessible to everyone, but currently some groups, including people with disability, LGBTQ+ people, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, experience unique barriers to being heard and believed, and may not trust the justice system or see it as a source of support. To increase reporting rates and ensure that more perpetrators of sexual violence are held accountable, we need to address the barriers stopping many people from coming forward.
Emily, I think what we're really talking about here is that we want people to have that choice actively to seek legal redress and justice where they've been subject to sexual violence, but it always remains their choice.
Absolutely. It's so important to maximize the agency and choice of people who have experienced sexual violence and ensure that they have access to the right support and the right information so that they're able to make informed choices about what's best for them.
You make such an important point that we do require a system that enables accountability for these crimes. We can't end sexual violence in a culture that doesn't hold people accountable for using sexual violence. So for us, ending sexual violence includes prevention, response, and making sure that our legal system enables accountability. And in that process, we're trying to build a system that has a focus on healing and recovery. Whether your healing and recovery takes the pathway of legal response or whether it takes a different pathway, we believe that part of the end of sexual violence means ending the long-term trauma impacts of being subject to sexual violence. So where do we go from here? Full Stop Australia is absolutely passionate about ending sexual violence in this country. We are really ready to take things to the next level. You can see Emily has led an advocacy program at Full Stop Australia that's been part of a collective effort with our colleagues and in solidarity with victim survivors and other colleagues that have seen landmark reforms and progress to protect the rights of victim survivors. And you can see those here. Emily, you've been involved in a number of those. And what do you think is the sort of top learning for us about how do we mobilise support to create this kind of significant legal change?
Well, it's so important to, as you've said, focus our advocacy on the needs of victim survivors of sexual violence and continuously work towards making the justice system safer, fairer, more trauma-informed and more responsive to those needs. And that means giving people choice and agency about how they want to engage with the justice system and support services. And it means ensuring that people have all of the information and all of the support to make informed decisions. Some of our recent work in this space includes advocating for affirmative consent legislation across the country, which appropriately shifts the burden of demonstrating a lack of consent from victims to perpetrators of sexual crimes. And that includes appearing at last year's Senate inquiry on consent legislation. We've also recently advocated for bail reform in New South Wales following the tragic death of Molly Ticehurst, where we advocated for reform that ensured that all bail decisions appropriately recognised the seriousness of sexual violence and considered it an indicator of serious risk. And we've also been contributing to the Australian Law Reform Commission's inquiry into justice responses to sexual violence. And we're currently working on a comprehensive submission to the Law Reform Commission, which fundamentally reimagines how the justice system could work to deliver real justice. Finally, we've been contributing to the advocacy of the Your Reference Ain't Relevant campaign founded by Harrison James and Jared Grice, which is working towards national law reform so character references can no longer be used in the sentencing of child sexual offenders. All of this advocacy work focuses on putting a victim-centric perspective forward and ensuring that all justice system processes appropriately meet the needs, safety and recovery objectives of victim survivors.
So to sum up this brief webinar that highlights, that A, we need to believe that we can end sexual violence in Australia, and B, that together we will be a much stronger force than any one of us apart. There are 5 key things that we know need to happen. We need to prevent sexual violence from happening, and we are hoping to explore that further over the coming months. We need to respond and support to people who've been subject to violence. We need to make sure that victim survivors of sexual violence are front and centre, and we create systems that enable choice and agency, healing and recovery. We need reform of systems and laws, and critically, we need to adequately fund specialist services that will provide the kinds of responses, and that includes services like ours. It includes peer support services for sexual violence survivors, and it includes all of those other frontline services, health, mental health, domestic and family violence services that together address the holistic needs of victim survivors. We need communities to join us, and we need you to be part of our community. I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. And, you know, we're so grateful to have you as part of our community, and we invite you to be part of Full Stop's world. I can't end today without telling you that we need support, whether it's you, your colleagues, your friends. We really invite you to join with us because we've got so much more to do. 50 years strong at Full Stop Australia, from Sydney Rape Crisis Collective to Full Stop Australia, 50 years of advocacy, education and specialist service supports. We want another strong decade, another strong century of work, hopefully ending sexual violence. You can donate to us to help us deliver our unfunded advocacy and some of our ongoing support services. And we would love for you to just join our community and be part of our fight to end sexual violence. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to further opportunities and webinars to have conversations with you about what will it take to end sexual violence in Australia. We thank you for your time.